How I took down my racist landlady and a noisy neighbor. A little over a year ago, I moved to a smallish town. I found a decent duplex out on the outskirts, plenty of room for just myself. When I spoke to the landlord, or landlady I guessed, she had implied that she'd had quite a few other people look at the place, but that these weren't the sort of people she wanted moving in. It was heavily implied, though never explicitly stated, that she wouldn't allow minorities to move into her duplexes. I really didn't care, as it was none of my business, and as long as I could get the place, I was happy. So, I moved in a week later, and at first, all was well. I work Tuesday through Saturday, 8-5 every week, though I frequently get off later than 5. My job consists of driving a company truck and going to customers' houses to fix their shit. I sometimes deal with as many as 10 different people a day. At the end of the day, the only thing I usually want to do is go home and veg out in front of my computer. The last thing I want to do is interact with other people or have to deal with a bunch of noise. Unfortunately, my neighbor was running her own daycare next door, watching as many as 10 or 12 kids in her little 1,000 square foot unit. She would allow these kids to run wild. My typical Monday, which was one of my weekend days, would consist of waking up at about 7 a.m. to the sounds of kids banging on walls and jumping on furniture, and hearing my neighbor scream at the tops of her lungs. This would go on all day until about 7 p.m., with no respite. Now, I knew when I moved in that she ran her own small daycare, but I didn't think it would be a problem. After all, I used to watch kids as well, only I was good at it, and I made sure the kids I watched were well behaved. Naturally, I assumed that someone running their own daycare would have the skill to control the kids. Not so. After a few weeks of this, I ended up losing my patience. I knocked on my neighbor's door and engaged her in small talk. I didn't want to immediately tell her to shut the fuck up, so I just made it seem like a friendly chat. During the small talk, I realized that this bitch was nuts. This was the first time we'd ever talked, and within just a few minutes, she was telling me that she had an STD. I quickly forgot her name, but I always refer to her by the nickname I gave her, Crotch Rot. Well, after a few minutes of conversation with Crotch Rot, I decided to broach the subject of excessive noise. I started out by asking her if I was noisy, and assuring her that if I ever became noisy, she could ask, and I would quiet down. She assured me that she never heard a peep from me. She then asked me if she was noisy, to which I replied that there was an awful lot of noise during the day while she was watching kids. Now, I'm still trying to keep things civil and friendly, but things start going off the rails. She apologizes and tells me that running a daycare is noisy business. She explains that this is her only source of income, and she has no choice in the matter. I ask her if she's able to keep the kids from banging on the walls at the very least, to which she replies that she's one person with 10 kids, and she can't be everywhere at once. At this point, I realize that being Mr. Nice Guy isn't working. This filthy bitch is just going to keep making excuses and avoiding the issue, rather than actually try to do something about it. I suggest that she either hire on some help, or take some lessons to learn to better deal with young children. She suggests I move somewhere else, and that it was stupid to move in when I knew the next door unit was a daycare. Well, at this point, I'm just pissed. This bitch does a shitty job of running a daycare and handling children, and has the nerve to call me stupid? I decide to go to war. Before going back into my own unit, I make one more statement. Do you have a license to run a daycare? Well, it turns out that Crotch Rot is good friends with Landlady, and at the beginning of the next month when Landlady comes to collect rent, she serves me an eviction notice, giving me 30 days to leave. Her explanation is that I'm causing tensions among the other tenants and being a troublemaker. Keep in mind, the only other tenant I've spoken to has been Crotch Rot. Well, neither of these bitches know who they're fucking with. I'm the last person to just roll over and take it in the ass, especially when I feel that something unjust has been done. I do my research and learn about my state's childcare laws. I learn that there is a limit to how many children an unlicensed facility can care for, which is also based on how many caregivers there are. I also learn that there are certain requirements, such as state workers inspecting the facilities and doing background checks on the caregivers. All of that licensing information is public domain, so I do a search, and sure enough, my neighbor is unlicensed and illegally watching children. After that, I do some research on housing equality laws in my state. Turns out it's illegal for anyone, even a private owner, to discriminate against potential tenants on things like race, sex, religion, etc. First things first, I call up the Department of Child Protective Services and report my neighbor. I explain that she's unlicensed, that she's clearly unable to handle the children she's watching, and that I frequently hear banging and yelling coming from her unit, which has me concerned for the safety and well-being of the children. A bit of a fib there, but I figured I should spice it up a bit. Well, much to my surprise, it only takes about an hour before 2 CPS agents and a couple of police are pulling up in front of the duplex. They force Crotchrot to call each of the parents to come pick up their children, then explain to the parents that if something were to happen to their children, that they could be held liable for leaving their children with someone who isn't equipped to handle them. Crotchrot ends up getting slapped with a hefty fine and an order to appear in court. For the first time since I moved into that duplex, I was happy for the thin walls. I just sat there drinking a few beers and listening to all the chaos. It went on for hours. I slept like a baby that night. So, Phase 1 of Operation Duplex Destruction was complete. Crotchrot was ruined. I'd destroyed her only source of income, permanently, caused her financial distress in the form of a fine, and got her in trouble with the law. It was time to proceed to Phase 2. By now, most of my stuff was packed, and I'd found a new place to live a few miles down the street. A couple weeks after moving to my new place, I invited a few of my co-workers over to have a few beers, though I had ulterior motives. It just so happens that I invited 2 black co-workers and a white co-workers. After we'd had a couple beers, I explained the real reason I wanted to get together. I'd been working on a plan to get back at some racist cunt of a landlady, and I was ready to put the plan into action. Fortunately, me being such a likable guy, and on great terms with all my co-workers, they were more than happy to go along. I went ahead and had one of my black co-workers call up the landlady and ask about her for rent listing, and set up a time to meet her and check the place out. I instructed my other black co-worker to wait a couple days and do the same, and instructed my white co-worker to wait until the end up of the week to do the same. A week and a half came and went. During that time, all 3 of my co-workers had met with the landlady to check out the unit. She told my 2 black co-workers that she'd already found another tenant and sent each of them on their way. But when my white co-worker showed up later that week, she told him that she hadn't found anyone to rent yet, but that she'd had some unsavory characters show interest. Well, this was more than enough for me. I got in touch with my state's Commission on Human Relations department. I explained that I had referred a few friends to check the place out, and that the owner of the properties was blatantly refusing to rent to minorities. I also called up the NAACP and explained the situation to them. It's now been about 2 months since all of that happened. I checked back with the NAACP this morning to ask for an update on the situation. Racist landlady was slapped with a fine and is currently being sued by the NAACP for tens of thousands of dollars. Operation Duplex Destruction is a success.